Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another Aptora internal training session. For our YouTube video, this is training for Aptora and RA tax and accounting employees. I invite my coworkers. Some, it's not an invitation, it's a demand, it's required. And for others, they're here voluntarily. But we do training every week, and we record almost all of these, especially when I remember to hit the record button, which I forgot last week. It was the greatest video ever, and it didn't get recorded. But I'll remake it. So this time I hit record. It'll make it on YouTube. Today we're going to talk about preferences. So let's close that. Let's close that and open preferences. We can do it with the toolbar here or go to edit preferences, either way. One sign of a software program's evolution is its preferences and settings. So in other words, the more evolved a company is, a software program is rather, the more settings and preferences it generally has. That's because as you sell this software and you perfect it over the years, you tend to want to add preferences and settings to try to please the most people you can. And we work hard to please our core industry, the industries that we serve, and we add preferences that make sense. Most preferences are a difference of opinion, by the way. People have differences of opinion on how things ought to run. So we will often add a preference. We'll add a feature and turn a preference on or off for that feature, or we'll change behavior with a preference. If you're out shopping for software of any kind, always go to preferences, whether it's a phone, operating system, you name it, go to preferences. To be frank, though, there's disadvantages. The more preferences you have, generally, the harder it is or the longer it takes to learn the software. It's not that the software is that complicated. There's just a lot to it. Total Office Manager is definitely like that. There's a lot to it. So all these preferences mean longer learning time. But ultimately, what it means is software that's much more flexible. So I'll say one last thing before we get started. Believe me, there is no secret to making easy-to-use software. There isn't any secret. The real secret, if there was one, to easy software, just like easy consumer electronics, is take away buttons, knobs, levers, controls, options, preferences. Take it all away. You want to make it simple, put one button on a blender. Just one button, on or off. A little more complicated, high, medium, low, off. And that's it. That's easy to use. Same with software, but most of our users don't want software like that. There is a market for that. But our software isn't that software, to be honest. It's for people that say, look, I have my own way of doing things. I'd like to know your recommendation, but ultimately I want to tweak it for my own use. And that's why we have all these options. So we'll start with preferences. Show the status bar. That's the bar down at the bottom. If you want to get rid of the status bar, you can uncheck that box and it will get rid of it. If you do get rid of it, by the way, it makes the software just a little bit faster for everybody, just a little bit, because that status bar is constantly hitting the database, asking if there's any information to update. The theme color changes the overall colors of the forms in the program. And why would you want to do that? Many of our users maintain multiple companies. Here at Aptora, I own a few different companies. And many, many, many years ago, we put a check in the wrong company. And someone said to me, one of my own coworkers said to me, can you make the software look different so I know which company I'm in? Because if you didn't know it, you can run multiple instances of this software. And we do. We might have 3 of them running. Well, if you change the color scheme, it helps. We have one company that we're not in very often, and we made it orange because orange looks terrible, by the way. But when you get in there, and I think it looks terrible anyway, when you get in there and see orange, you know you're in the wrong company, or at least you know which company you're in. So that is one of the reasons why we had that. Personalized menus, hit disabled, trust me. When you click the menu here, oftentimes you will see only a few selections and there'll be a little button down at the bottom to expand the menu. That's personalized menu. That was a Microsoft idea. And basically what it does is it only shows you menu options that you use on a regular basis. I don't like it personally. I disable it. Show the information center. That is this right here. And it can be on the left side or the right side. If you uncheck it, you can still open it. You saw me do it. You can still open it. So it's no problem. But that'll open it for you automatically on the left side or the right side. If you don't need the information center, then don't keep it open because, again, it hits the database looking for information on a regular basis. And it'll help, not a lot, but it'll help a little bit because it's less traffic going through the network. Show the toolbar. That's this up here. Many people don't want the toolbar because they want to capture that space. They want to use that space. And they prefer the menus. And that's me. I actually prefer the menus. I leave the toolbar up because a lot of times I'm training or demoing the program and I want people to know it's there. Now, depending on your screen resolution, you might actually have 2 rows of buttons. And you probably don't want 2 rows of buttons. I'd say that's probably overkill and it's taking up space that you might otherwise want to use. So you might want to get rid of buttons that don't matter to you, and you can do that by hitting the toolbar preference and get rid of those. Just uncheck it if you don't want it. Like, for example, you may never make payments, or it's really rare. So just uncheck that box to get rid of it. Sort list by date in descending order. What that does, and you can sometimes tell what things do if you hover over them, what that does is when you open up certain lists in the software, like the customer history form, it will sort them old to new. And you may not want that. You may want it in descending order by default. Now, you can always sort them yourself when you get in there, but that will do it automatically for you. And again, that's a difference of opinion. You might say, why would you have a preference on that? That's a difference of opinion. Half the group says you're crazy, half the group says you're crazy. So it's a preference. Display icons in the task panels. There are certain panels, customer job list, for example. If you go here, we can include icon images, and we got rid of those. Those icon images, we got rid of them. I don't really remember why, but I guarantee it was somebody calling, saying, I don't want that on there, and it became a preference. Now, under company preferences, we have list speed optimization. This is very important. If you are disappointed with the speed of the software, it could be fixed by using this feature. Now, there are other issues that could be involved, but I would definitely look into this. There is a great help topic. Just click here for details and advice, and we have a great help topic on this, and we'll explain more. But generally speaking, if you want to make the program faster, then you would want to use one of these features, such as the max list. What this does is when you open up a list, like a customer list, it will only show you a certain number of customers. You can see it says 20 records here, and that's because I have it set to 20 records. Now, you might say, we have a lot more customers than 20, so that won't work for me. But you can still search for your customers. If you type in search criteria, it'll still find customers, even ones that are not within your 20. You notice I typed in a Z, and that's going to be towards the end of my list. Now, if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense because if you go to, say, Amazon or Google and you do a search, they don't return 35,000 products or results. So why should we? But when that feature is not turned on, that's exactly what we'll do. When you open the customer job list, it could potentially show you 10, 15, some of you 50,000 customers. But that really doesn't make sense because you really want to go search for the customers and find what you're looking for. So if you turn that feature on, it will only provide you with 20, 50, 100, whatever you want. But to me, why go more than 20 or 50? If you do a search and you have 20 to pick from, chances are within that 20, you'll find what you were looking for. And if you don't, you really need to narrow your search down, which Tom makes it easy to do that. In Total Office Manager, you can come up with multiple pieces of information to search with. So chances are 20 is going to be just fine. That alone will make things much faster in the software, not just for you, but for everybody. Because keep in mind, all of you doing searches is network traffic. It's traffic to the database. And if we can make every user's traffic less, then we speed up the entire software experience for everyone. Again, if you want to know more, click that hyperlink and it'll take you to a help topic at support.aptora.com and you can learn more about it. But feel free to click that, set it at 20 or 50. Trust me, you'll probably never look back. This button right here, hide columns that significantly slow list performance. Let me just show you an example. If we open up our customer job list here, we have a lot of columns. Most of you don't need all these columns. It's just not information you really need because you'll probably open the record to see the information you're looking for. And all of that information takes time to load. So get rid of columns that you don't need. And how do you do that? You go to here, show columns right there. And you can see a lot of columns. Now, you can search, sort, and filter on those columns, which is handy, but you may not need them. Now, pay attention to any column that has an asterisk next to it, like financial history, yes or no, inside sales rep, markup method. You might not need the markup method. Who cares about that? So uncheck that box. Those make the list much faster. Much faster. Now, unchecking columns makes it a little bit faster, but anything with an asterisk makes it much faster. In some cases, some of them have more impact than others, but those are the ones you want to pay attention to. Now, rather than go into every one of these lists and do that, we made it easy on you. You simply go to Preferences and click the button. Now, keep in mind, these are company preferences, so that'll affect everybody, but that's okay because most of those people will speed up. Their software is going to speed up and they'll never miss the column. I mean, they won't even know it's gone because they didn't care about it anyway. They probably didn't even put it there. And if they need it, they can always put it back. Remember that. They can put it back. So my advice is turn on max list, set it at 20 or 50, hit that button. Down here, we have a couple of check boxes. Open old schedule board with schedule board buttons. So what that means is when you go click this button, do you want it to open the newer board or the old traditional board? And then enable mapping for schedule board, new. That's the new schedule board. If that's checked, that enables the mapping feature, the GPS mapping feature. That allows you to track your vehicles, mobile phones, technicians. So we have my preferences, that's per user, company preferences, that's for everybody. There's no save button. They happen automatically. Under appointments and schedule options, you have the ability to have a default amount of time when you create an appointment. You can have a default appointment type. You can turn on schedule board conflict checking. That will warn you when you go to create an appointment that you have a conflict. This button right here opens schedule board options. Remember, this is the old board, the traditional board. So it has its own set of options. I won't go into all of these right now, but they're pretty self-explanatory. Go in there and take a look at it. One of the best things is all the color coding opportunities. Under company preferences, we don't have any. So they're all by user. Auto recall. When you go to create a check, the software will say, do you want to recall the last transaction? When you pick a vendor, it's going to notice that you've done business with them before, and it'll offer to make a copy of that check. Now, that's handy some of the time, especially because it's generally easier to remove things. And you also have the ability to say, do not prompt me, yes or no, just do it. There are no company preferences for auto recall. That's by person. Chart of accounts. My preferences include smart account selection filtering. I generally recommend this be checked. Only advanced users should uncheck it. When it's checked, the software will prevent you from picking accounts, general ledger accounts, chart of accounts, that don't make sense. Now, sometimes you pick accounts that are a little odd, such as a contra account. If you know what a contra account is, then you can uncheck that box. If you don't know what a contra account is, check that box. It's a general rule of thumb. But I would go through this and make sure that most of your coworkers have that box checked, because you can really mess up the accounting system by picking a wrong account. In certain lists, when we're looking at our chart of accounts, you have the option to see the account numbers with the account name. Some people prefer account numbers because they have them memorized. They might have rent memorized by account number, not by the word rent. So you might want numbers. Other people don't. As you can guess, that's a difference of opinion. Our software did not start life with that option. That was probably somebody mad and can't believe we would do such a thing, and we turned it into a preference. Auto-generate chart of account numbers. When you go to create a chart of account, do you want the software to automatically suggest a number for you? And you may not, because you have a certain numbering convention. If you turn that on, you can also space out those numbers, increment those by, say, 10 or 100. I generally recommend 100. Company preferences. Use department overhead allocation. If you turn that on, your chart of accounts will allow you to allocate overhead by department. So that way you can print out an income statement by department. It'll allocate the overhead automatically for you, showing you net profit. You don't have to go into all your expenses and try to figure out what department they go to or a percentage split. You turn this feature on, the software takes care of it for you. You won't see that feature unless it's checked here. And I'll show it to you real quick. They are in the expense types. Overhead allocation method, it will default to labor because that is almost always the correct choice. It'll default to labor when you turn it on, and then you can change those individually. And if you wonder where they're set at, it's a column, and you can see it here. By the way, don't forget to set your fixed or variable expense. Is that expense fixed or is it variable? Be sure to set that up too. You can see I haven't done it. Shame on me. I got to get that done. Do not require vendor selection except for pay sales tax default, bank, and accounts payable chart of account. Okay, so what's that mean? When you go in to create an adjusting journal entry, the software oftentimes requires you to pick a vendor. It depends on what you're doing, but you might not want to pick a vendor for, say, creating, say, a liability. You don't want to pick a vendor. And that became a preference. We used to require that years ago. Now we don't. Under checking, there's only company preferences. Do not include any customer jobs in checks pay to list. It's probably not very common for a company to write a check to a customer. It happens though, but it depends on who you are, what you do. For the most part, you write checks to vendors, maybe to employees. So you may not want your customer list in here. Imagine if you have, say, 30, 50,000 customers. You may not want those in here. That feature allows that. Now, you can always uncheck it or check it. Maybe you want to refund a customer for a warranty claim. Maybe you have a full service warranty and you want to buy them out of their refrigerator that failed. You want to send them a check for $1,000. Turn it on, or pardon me, turn it off, uncheck it, write the check, go back and check the box. Do you want to allow duplicate check numbers? Chances are you don't. That'll prevent you from doing that. Company, a lot of preferences here. First thing is bring back one-time messages. Sometimes you'll see a message box and it includes a little box at the bottom that says, don't show me this anymore. Tired of seeing it. You can check that box. That'll bring them back. It brings all of them back, by the way, but it's by user. So you might discover, oh, maybe I shouldn't have clicked that. I wish it was reminding me of those things. That'll do it for you. Now, under the history form in the software, you have customer history, vendor history, history for all kinds of things. You can decide what columns you want to see. So that way, when you are in a customer and you right click, go to history, there may be columns that you don't want a certain employee to see. Or maybe you just don't want to see them. You don't care about the general journal. What is that thing anyway? And what's a credit and a debit? So you may not care about that. You can hide those. This is where you would set up your email. I took my information out for the video, but that's where you'd set up your email. And when you do, you can hit test account settings and it'll tell you if those are set up correctly. It tries to send a test email. There's a spell check feature in the software, and you can decide where your dictionary is. You have the dictionary we provide you, which can't be changed. And then you have a custom dictionary, which is where you add your own, like add to dictionary, that's where it would go. And then you have spell check options here. Under company, you can have a default warehouse. So whenever you pick a warehouse, there can be a default. You can have a default country. We have a country field, and most of you would probably want a default. When we auto number things, most things, not chart of accounts, but when we auto number things, such as a work order, you do have the option of including the year and a dash. And then the software will add a number, 001, 002, 3, 4, 5, etc. Turn that on if you want to see the year. Now that was added, again, grumpy customer. I shouldn't say grumpy. Maybe they were not grumpy. But chances are they were probably grumpy because they were used to it from their old program and they wanted it. You probably don't need that though, because in Total Ops Manager, it's easy to find things. Once you get used to the software, you'll notice you don't need some of these features that help you find things because searching is so easy. Allow duplicate numbers, miscellaneous. So that covers everything else. Where we don't have an express preference that says allow duplicate check number, this would cover everything else. Generally, you don't want that checked. Auto-populate new pop-up notes with info stamp. Now, we don't have time to go into all these features. So if you have used the software for a while, you already know what that does. That'll just automatically put the info stamp in the pop-up notes. We have a document scanning feature, and this enables the feature. And then you have the ability to decide the default location, which you can always change. But every time it asks you if you want to save, this will be the default, saving you some trouble. Credit card options. You can have numerous gateways, but you'll probably want a default. And this is where you select the default. Now, you would create additional gateways here, but that's your default. You also can delete credit card information. You may not want credit card information in here, and you may want to get rid of it. Also, you might want to copy the email settings to all users. Those are these settings over here. And you might think, well, we don't need individual settings. We're going to use the same settings for everybody. Or maybe it's most everybody. You hit copy settings, and now everyone has the same. And if a few people need different settings, they can go change those individually. Customer payment. Nothing for my preferences, but under company preferences, we have certain fields that are required. So in other words, the software will say, you can't save until you put in a memo. Do not auto-suggest credit application when receiving payments. If you check that, the software won't automatically try to create the credit for you. It won't automatically apply it. I can promise you that was a difference of opinion because I remember that call many years ago. Can't believe you do that. We don't want you doing that. We thought we were doing you a favor. We thought we were making the software easier to use. But then again, that's our claim to fame. I don't want to sound like I'm complaining. I'm not. These preferences and settings, you can leave them alone. But this allows you to tweak the software's behavior to meet your needs. Customer jobs, there's a lot of them here. Warn when saving customers that have duplicate contact info. I would turn that on. You can always say save anyway. Warn me if they're over their credit limit. So when you go to create a customer, pardon me, not create a customer, when you go to create a work order, something like that, you edit a customer. Whenever possible, the software will say, oh, they're over their credit limit. And you can set the credit limit in the customer form. Warn me when they have past due invoices, so they're late on their payments. Generally, I'd have that checked. Auto-populate the work address with a bill to address. So when you fill out the work address, or pardon me, the bill to address on the customer, is it almost always the same as work address? If it is, then you probably just want it to automatically copy it. But you've got a button that'll do that anyway. So you could always click that button right here, and whatever you put there will get copied over. So you may not need that feature turned on. Use automatic notes pop-up. This can be annoying, but very handy. When you use the software, many forms have a notepad, as we call it, and it'll pop up automatically, even if it's empty. And we did that on purpose, by the way, because we may want to open it up and show you it's empty. Hey, it is empty, because maybe it's not supposed to be, but it'll open up notes whenever you do a lot of things in the software, and you might find that annoying. That's a user preference, though, because certain people may or may not want it, depending on their job duties. Start new record with a quick filter. Now, this is helpful. When you go to search for a customer, if it can't find it and you create a new customer, it'll auto-populate with the search criteria. Somebody calls up, have you ever called us before? I don't know. I don't think so. May I have your phone number? You type in the phone number, can't find it. You click add new, it puts the phone number in there for you. You can always get rid of it. Use AIA billing feature. If you have this option, then you can turn it on here. Otherwise, it's turned off by default. Open the customer job list empty. Now, This is a little bit like the fast list or the max list feature we saw earlier, but it's just specifically doing one thing. When you go to open up your job list, customer job list, it will open it empty. Some of you might have 50, 80, 100,000 customers. We have clients with over 100,000 customers. You might be waiting 10 seconds to open 10,000 customers. But think about it. You go to Amazon or Google and type in a search, you're not going to get 10,000 or 100,000 results. You might want to search and just find what you're looking for. It'll show you all possible combinations depending on your max list setting. So generally, I would say do that. Don't open it with all your customers loading. Open it empty. Only load customer jobs with a balance on new payments. So what that does is when you go to receive a payment, we're only going to show you people that owe you money. And that makes sense. Some people don't like it. So it's an option. Company preferences, ooh, lots of them, aren't there? Again, that's the evolution of the software. You have a lot of defaults. So that way, when you go to create a record, it'll automatically put that info in there. That's nice, but you may not like that because you might not want it to automatically populate with residential. If you're residential 99% of the time or something like that, you might think that's a good idea. But keep in mind, it'll put that in there even if it's wrong, and it'd be easy to forget. Now, accounts receivable, your AR account, accounts receivable, that may be a no-brainer. You'll never change that. But remember, if you auto-fill these in, then the user might not realize it's wrong. So like tax code and tax item, you may not want that to auto-populate. You have required fields. We've seen those before. Down here, auto-select reimbursable. Most of the time, you can tell what this does when you're familiar with a feature and you hover over it and you get a tooltip. Sometimes our programmers forget those tooltips, and we'll find them and add them. But it should give you a tooltip. Auto select reimbursable. I would check that box. What that does is when you pick a customer on a PO or anything else, it'll automatically anything in the AP side of things, by the way. When you go pick a customer, it'll automatically mark it as reimbursable. Auto generate customer account number. Some of you might not realize it, but your customers have an account number and it'll automatically generate it for you. Show details on the history form. I would check that box. I'm going to show that one to you. I don't have time to show what everything means, but sometimes I really should. History. That is this pane right here. I picked one that doesn't have anything in it. Let's try to find something. Nothing in it. Well, if you had a bunch of tech notes, they would all be in this pane right here. And we added that feature many years ago, but somebody didn't like it. So it had to become a preference. And who wouldn't like that? You can adjust it, but it's great. As far as I'm concerned, it's great. By the way, if you didn't notice it, you could call this a preference. Include the entire family. Include the entire family here would be the whole family, 24-hour fitness corporate, the headquarters, and the entire family. Check that box. Now, I won't have time to get into all the other preferences because we literally have thousands. If we open up the contact log, as long as we're here, I want to point out two preferences down here. Include the entire family. So that way we see contact log notes for the whole family. And also include work order notes. The work order has its own contact log for this company or family. You can check those boxes to see all of it. And there's filters, obviously, too, to help narrow down what you're looking for. Show work order details on history. Same thing, but the work order history form. Do not load customer jobs on add. Do not load customer jobs on edit. I'm going to explain both of those at the same time. So if you were to go create, say, a work order, if you don't preload your customers, now I don't have that many in this database, this demo database, but you might have 100,000. You're going to have to wait for all 100,000 to load. And that may be slow. And keep in mind, that's network traffic that slows the whole company down. You might prefer just to use a lookup feature because you're not going to scroll through 100,000 anyway. Now, we do have filter as you type, but that may not work for you. So you might think to yourself, I just use the lookup anyway. So what you can do is save yourself a lot of time by not populating this list. And there's a load list anyway. So if you come into this form and say, I wish I had the 100,000 customers in here, you can always click this or click it to reload. Maybe somebody added the customer while you were staring at the list and it's not in here. You can reload it by clicking that. So I would generally recommend that you don't load on add. And then when you go edit a record, why have the whole customer job list available to you? If you open up, say, a work order and you want to edit the work order, how often does your company change the customer? If you change it a lot, then you might prefer that be loaded. But again, you can always use lookup and you can always reload the list. Chances are you don't change the customer very often. So what I would recommend is you don't have those load and it'll load faster. And remember, anything faster for a single user makes the software faster for everybody. Sometimes just a little bit, but they add up. Auto-populate the customer name field. So what that does is when you type in a name, when you're creating a new customer, it'll auto-populate the name field for you. And we don't have time to go in and demo each of these, but you know what I'm talking about if you've been using the software. Do not require a password to bypass credit hold. If you decide that you want the software to warn users about credit hold, then what happens is it does not allow you to do what you're doing without the admin password. But you may say to yourself, look, I don't want to put in a password. Just give us the warning. That's an option for you. Customer name format. When you display the customer's individual name, not a company name, but an individual name in the program, and there's many places, you can decide how you want it. You want it to be salutation, Mr. James R. Leichter, or do you want it to be Leichter, James R., or James Leichter, or Leichter, comma James? So you have options. Now, we didn't start life like that. I think we had a default. You couldn't change it. But over the years, people said, hey, I do it differently. Auto-populate the customer contact field. So we have a contact field in the customer form. Do you want to auto-populate it? If so, how? Again, it'll make sense when you use the software. If you're new to the software, some of these things are hard to understand, and I don't have time to go into them. But if you use the software, you'll say, oh, I see what that's for. A default markup method. Do you have a default markup method? If so, you can pick it. Additional overhead. What this allows you to do is pre-populate the overhead, the additional overhead fields in the customer. If you haven't used that feature, it's in your job info tab. This one here. You can have additional overhead for a job, and you can assign the overhead as a percent of the final amount or assign the overhead as a dollar amount. You can also add a labor burden. If you're confused by that, There are help topics on this, but this just allows you to tell the software, look, I know what you think the job cost, but I want you to add some extra labor burden, some extra overhead. And maybe you do that because you pay commissions based on a certain set of rules. You pay based on net profit, and you want to put the department's 37% overhead on that job in the job costing report. You can do that. The job costing reports don't show overhead unless you use that feature. So you can have a company default here, which is handy. Cutoff date. You had the ability to disallow users modifying accounting records, and you can have a cutoff date. So basically what this would do is when turned on, I would say nobody is going to be able to modify an accounting related record. So that generally means anything with dollars and cents on it. They're not going to be allowed to modify it on or before December 31, 2019. Now, what if you need to modify such a thing? It will challenge you with an admin password, and you should not share the admin password with people. Nobody should be logging in as admin. So it'll challenge you with the admin password. You can also warn people if they're entering a transaction that's a certain number of days in the future or in the past. That's helpful if you so-called fat finger things, like you type in 2109 and you didn't mean to, and that happens a lot. Or, maybe it's 1907 you typed in, and now you got a transaction that isn't going to show up on your financials because the date's wrong. And how would you ever know it? It's not easy to see those unless you know to look for them. That would allow you to get a warning that says, are you sure? You sure that's the date you meant to enter? And by the way, if you want to check, you can always go into your transaction list and you can sort your transactions by date to look for old and new. But if you come into this form, it will show you the last transaction date. And you can see I have one for 2030, and maybe I didn't mean to do that. And my first transaction could be 1910. I saw that once, 1910. And we fixed that. And they're like, oh, that helped. Now that was why. So check that and just be sure that you don't have any transactions that are dated incorrectly. Under deposits, we have a default bank account. Remember, defaults are terrific until they're not. A default saves you a click or two, but if it varies a lot, if whatever it is varies a lot, I would not have a default. I would force the user to pick something. As you probably know, we have a document manager feature. We probably should have called it a file manager because it doesn't have to be documents, it can be anything. There aren't really any preferences here except for our cloud customers. These are people that host this application on the internet. Under items, my preferences, we just have one, a default item type. So when you go to create an item, we'll default the type. Under company preferences, we have much more defaults, many more defaults. We also have an item alias feature. This allows you to set up alternative item numbers, and it also helps you improve your barcode scanning ability. You can also use vendor-specific pricing. That way, when you create purchase orders, you have the option of using the vendor's part number and even the vendor-specific price, as opposed to the price you normally pay or the average price. Inventory by employee means that you can track inventory by employee. Each employee can be assigned to a warehouse, and you can track inventory by the employee. You can also assign warehouses to users. You can have multiple warehouses, and you can assign those to a user, such as assigning a driver to a vehicle. So I'll give you an example. We decide that vehicle number 1 is going to be a warehouse, and we're going to call the warehouse truck number 1. We can also assign Bob Johnson to that truck, to that warehouse. Use the item assembly feature. The software has the ability to assemble multiple items into a single unit. Many of you would never need it, but it does allow you to take, say, 10 inventory parts and maybe some labor, wave a magic wand, make all of that disappear, and create a new item with a new number. So it relieves inventory to create a new item. Most of you don't need it, but if that sounds like something you wished we did, there you go. Use the item reservation feature. You have the ability to reserve items for customers and jobs, much like you might have done with a piece of paper. You wrote sold, James sold this, sold to Bob Johnson, whatever, and you stuck it on that box and hope nobody took it, sold it out from under you. You can do that electronically. That will add buttons to various forms. If you turn that on, you'll start seeing item reservation on certain forms. Use labor minutes. Again, hover over it. You can probably see what it does, but it adds a field to your invoices, estimates, sales that total up the labor minutes found on all your items. So when you create an item, you can optionally enter the number of minutes that it would take to deal with that item or service. So it could be a sheet of metal or a roll of pipe, and you could apply minutes to that, and those add up in the estimate or the invoice. That's handy to help you decide how much labor to apply to an estimate, as an example. There's also a unit of measure feature that would allow you, for example, to buy 100 gallons of material and sell it by the gallon, or a 250-foot roll and sell it by the foot. Finally, include inactives in item lookup. When you go to search for items in various forms, maybe you want to also be able to find inactivated items. If you do, check that box. That's a company preference. Remember, you can always turn it on and off. Under login, we have reminders. Remind me of reminders. Remind me of unread phone messages. So do I have any of these? Remind me of those. And if you check that box, we consider it read. But you know what? Maybe you read it, but have you done what you're supposed to do? When you do, check that box. Just a little tip there. Notify me of unread sales opportunities on startup. Now, you don't really read a sales opportunity, but we know if you've been in there. So if somebody creates a sales opportunity for you, how would you ever know you have a new sales opportunity? Well, if you use this feature, it will tell you you have a sales opportunity. And it'll also tell you down here, SOM is Sales Opportunity Manager, and I've got 12. So if I were to go open those and close them, the reminder will go away. I've got 89 reminders. I've got 6 unread messages. I mean, this guy needs to be fired, right? I'm not doing my job. Hide graphical navigator on startup. You can always open it, but that's this. Notice how I opened it. You can always open it, but you may not care to have it open on startup. Company preferences, there aren't any. Pay bills. You have a default account. Show tax calculator. That is very helpful. That will allow you to have your sales tax distributed among all of the items or the items of your choice on a bill. That is definitely a preference due to somebody's difference of opinion. So when you go to enter a bill, you can have a line item called sales tax, use tax if you want. But you also have the ability to have the software take that tax and divide it out equally or a way of your choice to each of the items. Do not suggest vendor credit application. We saw that earlier, but this is on customer pay bills where we're pardon me, I said customer, I meant vendor. This is on the vendor pay bills form. Add bill reference number to the credit card charge bill payments. I would say yes to that. I should have that checked. Payroll. My preference is just one. Warn if they have used more time off than they are allowed. Under company preferences, we have defaults, lots of defaults, timesheet defaults, payroll setup defaults. You have the ability to enable the payroll service. Let's say that you don't process your own payroll, you use a third party. You can enable the payroll service, and you'll need to put that company in as a vendor. You don't have to do anything special to them, but put them in as a vendor and pick them. Do you use direct deposit? If you don't, hide the feature. Do you want to track workers' compensation? If you don't, hide the feature. But the software has the ability to allow you to pick the workers' compensation code on each timesheet line entry. Do you use certified payroll? If you've never heard of it, uncheck it. By unchecking things, we're trying to make the software easier to deal with. Use labor costs for commissions. I don't care about that. You might say, uncheck it. Timesheets. Don't load work orders that have been invoiced or are completed. Here, under timesheets, you have the ability to go pick a customer, of course, and you have the ability to pick a work order. Now, notice I have a lot of work orders because I'm showing all kinds of work orders, and you may not think that makes sense. So you might say, look, don't load work orders that have already been invoiced and are marked as completed, both. Purchase orders. You can establish a company-wide PO limit, and to exceed it, admin password. There is a rate field on your purchase orders, and that's the price that you expect to pay for the item, and you have several options for that. And again, if you read them, you'll know what those mean if you've used the software. So most of these are pretty self-explanatory. Disable automatic PO numbering, don't want that typically. Required fields, we have 3 selections for you. We've never needed to add more. You might wonder, how come there's only 3 and there were many others elsewhere, just based on feedback from customers. Auto update the item's estimated cost with the PO rate field. Many of you are going to see that pop up. It's going to say that the estimated cost is different than what you're paying today. Generally, you want to auto update it. That estimated cost doesn't affect your accounting, but it's useful. It helps people understand what we should be paying, among other things. And you can also pay commissions off estimated versus actual. Quick filter. The quick filter is the filter at the top of the lists. The major lists have this quick filter up here. Now, when you start typing in something, I typed in the letter A, you'll notice it took a while to do the search. How long it takes depends on that setting. 3 seconds, I wouldn't have anything lower than that, because you could be typing and it starts searching. And then you type again, it starts searching again. And I've had people call and complain, this software is ridiculous. This field is going spastic, or this list is spastic. And it's because it's set to 1 second. So I'd set that to 3, and that means when you're done typing, 3 seconds tick by. If you're a fast typist, 1 or 2 seconds might be fine. Now, when you do a search, do you want to do a partial search, which we typically call like, or do you want to do a starts with? If it's like, then it searches for that string anywhere in that field. If it starts with, it's literal. And then you have some options when you search for dates and numeric fields. Under company, we don't have any quick filter company options. My preferences. Display the 10 most recent records in the information center. So we remember the information center, right? This guy here, and I said that it talks to the database. Well, you can speed things up if you don't have it opened. But if you like to have it open, you might consider just showing the 10 most recent records. or you can do all if you prefer. Company, this is important. On the old schedule board, we can automatically refresh it. Generally, you'd check that box, but most of you shouldn't be using the old board. Use the new one. Now, this is auto refresh changed lists every how many seconds? You probably want to keep this at a few minutes. Now, here's what this is doing. When you're working in a list, how often do you want this list to refresh? Because somebody in another room could be modifying these records. They might change a value. Any change they make, it'll refresh, potentially. Now, when you make a change, or when you search, sort, filter, it refreshes anyway. But you may not want this to sit and refresh needlessly, because even if you're not using it, as long as it's in front of you, it won't do it if it's behind you. It has to have focus, as we call it. But if it has focus, it'll refresh every 30 seconds, whether you need it to or not. And, right when it starts to refresh, what if it's refreshing 100,000 records? If you want to go create a deposit or add an item, you have to wait for that refresh event to finish. So you may not like that behavior at all. I don't. I uncheck it. But if you do check it, I would set it to like 3 minutes or so, because chances are you just don't need it to refresh, since it's refreshing as you work in it anyway. Under reports, we don't really have too much here for my preferences. When you open a report, do you want it maximized or not? That was added many years ago. Somebody wanted to return the software. The whole program wanted to throw the whole program back at us because it wouldn't open a report window maximized, and his old one did, and it was a deal breaker, and that's the truth. And so that was added. There's nothing under company preferences. Sales Opportunity Manager, first thing is you can turn it on, and then you'll see this set of features. It's a great set of features, by the way. And then you can have certain required fields. Sales tax, you can use your sales tax reports. You can generate them based on a cash basis. If it's unchecked, it's accrual. Most of the time you want cash basis. It depends on your sales tax authority. Do you pay your sales tax based on cash basis accounting? In other words, when you get paid, do they get paid? Or do they tell you, look, I don't care if you get paid or not, we want our sales tax? And if you pay your sales tax, there's a form to do that. You can have a default bank account. Typically, that's a good idea because it doesn't change. Only show sales tax groups in selections. What that means is when you go to pick a sales tax item or a group, you can limit it to the groups of taxes only. So many of you have groups, and you want groups to be used because you might pay the city, the county, and the state, all three. So you have 3 sales tax items grouped into one called Kansas sales tax or Prairie Village sales tax. City of Prairie Village, County of Johnson, State of Kansas, create a group called Prairie Village sales tax. Only show me groups. For invoices, sales, and estimates, it's pretty straightforward. Warn if we're selling out of stock. I'd say yes. Warn me if I'm selling out of stock. Prompt me to create a PO when I sell out of stock. So in other words, you just sold into the out of stock. You should really create a PO. You want one or not? Add reimbursables to. We have a reimbursables feature, as many of you know, but you may not know that you can add those reimbursables to the beginning, to an inserted selection row, or to the end. Add item reservations, same story. When you add your reservations, where do you want them? Invoice email options. Which one by default? You can manually change it. So again, this program is very evolved, as you can tell. This is a lot. You're probably looking at the clock going, I can't believe how long this is. But these are all different ways of doing things. And people have different ways, and these are time savers. for the company preferences, we almost need to make this screen bigger, right? Anything else is going to cause us to make the screen taller or wider. You have lots of required field options. You have options when you create, again, your invoice, your estimate, your sale. Bill to address, what goes on line 1? What goes under attention? Same way with work address. You can always edit it, but these are the defaults. You can have default departments. Typically, you wouldn't have a default department. You want that to come over from the work order or from the customer or something like that. So typically, you wouldn't have that. Always default to employees' default department. So you have the ability to establish a default department for an employee. When you create the invoice, do you want to use their department? Probably not, but some people do. Customer message, ship via defaults. Lots of checkboxes down here. Do you want to automatically add the sales rep to the assigned commission form? We don't have time to get into that feature if you haven't heard of it. Do you want to exclude commission amounts to the invoice analysis report? So when you go to the invoice, you can analyze it or the estimate. Let's look at some of these that may not be so obvious. Do not include vendors in the sales rep selection. That'll speed things up if your sales rep is never a vendor or a 1099. These are important. Include the work order brief description, detailed description, and the technician's notes when creating a sale invoice estimate. Probably want that. Include the work order items when you create the sale invoice estimate. Probably do. It's easier to get rid of them. Include items from those forms when creating work orders. When you create an estimate, sale, or invoice, I'll just start saying invoice, do you want to mark it as to be printed? Do you want to allow the user to actually sell items you don't have? I would like to see that unchecked, but I know in the real world that's hard. Allow item account selection. So you have the ability to change your GL accounts at an item, line item level for your items. Chances are you don't want to allow it. Show the accounts receivable selection. If they never change the accounts receivable, then you probably don't want to show it to them. Disable automatic numbering. Chances are you don't. Use cost when adding reimbursable items to an invoice, except for inventory and serialized items. So when you use the the reimbursable feature, you have the ability to use the cost, and that doesn't include inventory and serialized. So again, that's more clear when you've used the reimbursables feature. When it comes to serialized items, do you want to allow people to create an invoice without selecting a serial number? And that's handy when you sell it and then order it. So somebody comes in and says, I want that oven, and you don't sell that oven, you don't stock it, or an appliance or whatever, but you do want to create in an invoice and collect all or part. This will allow you to sell a serialized item and not force you to pick a serial number. And then you order it, receive it, and go fix the invoice later and probably print them a final. Security, it should be turned on. Enable security. Do you want their passwords to expire? Use zeros for never expire, but it really should expire once in a while. Error logging. This logs internal errors by default. I think that number's at 1,000. You can leave it there. Those are those yellow screens that you sometimes see. We can log those to the database for diagnostic purposes. Cannot edit other users' contact log entries. We saw the contact log earlier. Do you want me to be able to edit your contact log entries? Probably not. Chances are. Require approval to print and email. So you have the ability to set up an approval process for these forms and even a threshold, a dollar amount threshold. If you turn that feature on, they won't be able to email or print an estimate or a PO, for example, without approval. They get approval through security. You go into that user, and your last form allows you to give them approval rights. So that's a great feature. Service agreements. Most of these we've seen before. Automatically add a service agreement discount. So when you create certain records, do you want to automatically give them their discount? 15%, whatever it is? You might. You might find it annoying. Escrow accounting. This is a deep topic. If you don't know what that is, what it allows you to do is control how you recognize service agreement income. When you sell a service agreement that lasts 1 year for $1,000, you have the ability to recognize $1,000 worth of income today. But if you turn escrow accounting on, then you can recognize the income based on different methods, like, for example, the date of the work orders, or divide the $1,000 by 12 months or whatever the period is of the service agreement. And if you use the service agreement batch renewal system, then you can tell the system, when I renew a service agreement, I want you to create new service agreements. That's my recommendation, typically. Or I want you to extend the date of an existing service agreement. That can be handy when you sell them in perpetuity. If you sell them on an annual basis and you do the traditional renewal, that's probably the option. But if you sell a service agreement and hit them every month until they cancel, you might want to extend the dates. If you haven't seen it, that service agreement renewal system can be found in the service agreement list here. Vendors. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory. I think you have the ability to suppress certain messages. If you hit save and new, you can keep the vendor selection, auto-populate work bill to address. We saw that for customers. Under company, you can have a default account, and you might have the same discount account all the time. So in other words, if you pay your bill early, where do you want that money to go? If it's always the same or close to the same, you might have a default. Do not include payroll service bills in history. So when you go to your vendor's history, if they're the payroll service, you may not want to show the payroll related bills to the average user, and you can exclude those. That way you're not showing paycheck information. If somebody has access to the vendor list, they can get to the paycheck company. And if they can get to the history form also, which is protected by security, but if they can get to the history form, you may not want that to show up. You probably want that checked. Web updates. If you're hosted, you won't see this, but this just controls who gets reminded about an update. You may not want your people to get reminders, and you may not want to give them permission to even see the check for updates form. You might want to control that process. You also have the ability to save the update. If you do that, it just saves you a little bit of bandwidth. If the update gets downloaded by one person, then the rest of the company will share it. They'll share the update. So they're not downloading it from the internet, they're downloading it from whatever path you pick. Work orders. My preferences, you have a default work order type. So if your company does service mostly, you might pick that. Under company preferences for work orders, you notice we have a lot of work order email paging options. Some people still use paging systems. So these are all the fields that you might want to include. We have required fields here. There's a default priority setting for a work order. Allow duplicate work orders. Maybe not, but maybe you like to do that. Disable automatic work order numbering. Probably not. always default to employees, default departments. So when you create a work order and you add the employee, the technician, do you want to change the department on that work order to the one that's in the employee's default? So when you go to create an employee, you can have a default department. Do you want to use it? Chances are no, but it's hard for me to say because your company might be different. Finally, we have a zip code database. Do you want to use it? When you type in a zip code, it auto-populates the information. And you can have a default area code. And by the way, if you weren't aware of it, you can maintain the zip code list yourself. They're here. You might want to delete zip codes that you would never need because there's about 50,000 of them. And you have the ability to add or correct if we have the information wrong. So that is the preferences form. And I still haven't talked about preferences on various forms. So for example, and I won't go into it, but I just want to show you what I mean. If we wanted to spend more time on this video that's already too long, then we could go into receive payments. And I right click and go to preferences. So there's preferences all over the place. And we haven't even talked about those. So be sure to look around when you're on a forum. Don't be afraid to right click. Even if there's no button, right click on the forum. You might see some preferences. Certainly the big ones are each of the major lists have preferences. They have searching preferences, the filter or find as you type. They have column preferences, and some have others. All right, that concludes the video on preferences in Total Office Manager by Aptora. Did anyone have any questions on anything we've seen so far? Don't be afraid to ask. All right, very good. Nobody wants to be on there asking questions. That's all right. I appreciate everybody watching this video. If you hung in there this long, then you realized, wow, Total Ops Manager has a lot of preferences. Probably by the time you see this video, we've added more because remember, they are a response to customer requests and they typically represent a difference of opinion. And boy, are there lots of differences of opinion. I'm James Leichter with Aptora, and I really appreciate you being on here with me. Thank you, everybody.